Okay, so we're trying to wrap up by 5:30. So basically, this session now is to kind of go through the panel chairs are going to be discussing quickly what are the key recommendations from their panels for the G7 Secretariat. The Ministry of Foreign Affairs have kindly agreed that our recommendations can be shared with Foreign Minister Hayashi. So we're really hoping that this session has been both an interesting conference, but also that we will actually try to have some real influence on the G7 summit in Hiroshima, and thereby some kind of influence on the world, which I guess is what this kind of thing is all about. So I will now ask in order the chairs from the sessions to please present your summaries and keeping them relatively brief on the outcomes from their panel discussion. Thank you very much. So first of all, that would be Professor Koide. Yeah.
Okay, yes. Let me summarize the discussion of G7 contribution to global governance to come out 3 recommendations. Okay, first discussion. The G7 has been taking various functions and roles throughout different phases since its start in 1975. It started as a developed country club to deal with the economic crisis and the new Cold War tension in the 1970s and 1980s. Then the G7 became an engine to promote the post-Cold War globalization process in the 1990s and 2000s. Then G7 became a core of expanding international networks to deal with the aftermath of the financial crisis of 2008 and the growing voice. G7 also became an institute to listen to the growing voice of the Global South. And finally, today, G7 is increasingly taking a role of promoting liberal democratic values in the management of various global issues such as non-proliferation, climate change, and human rights and human security issues. Okay, having been issuing several hundred promises on various international agenda, G7 countries have overall showed a high degree of compliance with their own policy goals. According to Professor Kopp, analytic team's account, almost 70% commitments are made at the past G7 meetings. Okay? Yes, almost 70% commitment were followed by their concrete policies or initiatives by the member states. And although the authority and function of G7 was overshadowed by the expanded group of G20 recently, particularly after the global financial crisis of 2008, as increasing number of global agenda such as climate change requires the cooperation and commitment of the Global South. But G7 still plays a core role of agenda setting for global governance, particularly through its synergy cooperation with G20 UN agencies. Okay, based on these observations, the first panel on G7 contribution to global governance came out with the following 3 policy recommendations toward the Hiroshima summit in May. First, in order to improve this performance and to meet today's unprecedented needs, G7 leaders at Hiroshima should commit to meet more often and mount more ministerial meetings. So meeting more is the important policy recommendation for G7. And second, G7 should improve its compliance by emphasizing the value of democracy and human rights in the management of global issues by holding ministerial level meetings on a particular subject and by establishing special working groups or task forces for that subject. And finally, Although the challenges are mounting, Japan G7 presidency and Hiroshima summit in May 2023 should be made an important opportunity to consolidate G7 synergies between its members' priorities and key aspects of the G20 UN agenda. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Koide. Next, I would like to ask Dr. Utsumi. Please give your panel recommendations.
Okay, first of all, I'd like to thank Professor Dobson and Professor Nagi again for their insightful presentations. So our session was titled Japan's Contribution to G7 Governance, and we've learned a historical perspective on Japan's contributions to the G7 in diverse areas, as well as the leadership Japan is expected to take at the summit this year and beyond. There were lots of important points addressed, but I'd like to cover 3 key points from our session. The first point is that as the only Asian country to be represented within the G7, Japan has been playing an important role in ensuring that the Asian region's voices are heard and included on the G7 agenda, which might be otherwise overlooked. So Japan is expected to continue to be instrumental in this role and including other stakeholders in the region in the process and on the G7 agenda. The second point is that Japan has been also playing an important role as a bridge between the US and other G7 members. Japan is so expected to cooperate with other G7 members in addressing broader issues that benefit not only a particular country, but also the global community. The last point is that among many global challenges that we are facing, in particular, Japan has been consistent in their efforts for denuclearization and disarmament. So the fact that the summit itself is being hosted in Hiroshima, which suffered from the atomic bombings in the past, has a significant meaning. And the issue on nuclear disarmament and non-proliferation will be one of the priority issues that would be highlighted at the summit. So Japan is expected to take a leading role in addressing and advancing the global efforts in this regard. So that's a brief summary of our session. And as a host of G7 this year, I believe that Japan will make valuable contributions in advancing security and sustainability at this significant time for the global community. So that concludes my part. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Dr. Utsumi. Next is Professor Kirton talking about the keynote address.
As chair of Mr. Ariyoshi's session, I, of course, had a distinctive responsibility because he was not asked to provide recommendations to the G7 leaders. He's the one who's doing that privately and then must deliver them on our behalf at Hiroshima. So in the first instance, which one of our recommendations, or ones from the first half, did he accept and agree to? Number one, he agreed that G7 leaders should meet more often. Indeed, he said he could pull together a G7 summit within 5 days, which means they could be meeting once a week, just like the European Union summits sometimes do. It does raise the possibility that they could have more meetings this year than just the one they've had, which was basically dominated by Ukraine, to do all the other subjects we've spoken about, and to be a genuine crisis response club. Secondly, he agreed more ministerials was a good idea. In fact, he said Japan had already upped it from the 14 they started with to 15, adding one for urban affairs. The question arising from that one is, why not one for our ministers of what we Canadians call national defense, right? We know Hiroshima is going to be dominated by the war in Ukraine. Nuclear weapons is going to be big. I think ministers of defense have something to say. about that. But if that's too rich to the blood, you could always start with aid to the civilian power, disaster relief, because our military is first responders there. But let's get them into the game. Thirdly, he said it was a 3-day summit, up from the last one Japan hosted. This would actually provide the time for all G7 leaders on the margins of the Hiroshima summit to take a trip together to Nagasaki, right? Fulfilling one of the recommendations I think Mitsuru Kurosawa suggested. No, by the way, why not take along at least one of the guests? I think it would be good for the Indian Prime Minister, who bears the legacy of May 1974 in India, to go along and see firsthand a second time the disasters that nuclear war brings. Fourthly, very quickly, Mr. Ariyoshi didn't mention it, it was in a slide. He did speak about who was invited as country leaders and why, but what about the multilateral organizations that were invited? Anyone notice that? The glaring absent, yet again, after 48, 49 years, the G7 is not inviting the head of even one of the world's multilateral environmental organizations, even though climate change is a big deal. And it's not as if they don't have many candidates to pick. UN Climate, UN Biodiversity, Nature-Based Solutions, IRENA, Renewable Energies, that's one that's popped up. United Nations Environmental Program, or if you want to go back to the beginning, even the WMO, meteorological, but why this great gap? Finally, the nuclear health link, which we were just discussing. Some of us are old enough to remember ban the bomb movement. Strontium 90 is bad for women who are breastfeeding and having kids. That, I think, was the beginning of civil society activism to get us to, the test ban treaty and more. And much more could be said. Is there a 311 Fukushima agenda about how things nuclear, can harm your health? And for those who called for more nuclear education, if we could reframe nuclear weapons and those associated with them as a health issue, would that help? That's an open question. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Kirton. And next, Professor Emmanuel.
Okay, so I had a 6-member panel, as you know, talking about controlling nuclear weapons. And I saw at least 9 interrelated key points that you can probably group together in 3 different groups that can be seen as proposals for the G7 participants. To begin with, there's these overall points. And first thing is that Japan has a unique moral authority when talking about the use of nuclear weapons. And I mean, they're in Hiroshima. It's just, they have this authority that no one else has. And this agenda can be pushed because of where they are. In addition to this, one of the members of the panel said that Japan also has expertise in helping countries and territories across the planet that had nuclear tests carried out on their territories. Algeria, Kazakhstan, Marshall Islands, Tahiti, etc. So Japan also is critical there as well. Secondly, the G7 should really, and several people mentioned this, understand the centrality of the Reagan-Gorbachev axiom of a nuclear war cannot be won and must never be fought. So that's really an important point that several people went over. Also, the G7 should increase efforts to reduce rhetoric around the use of potential Russian nuclear weapons in the war in Ukraine. It's a critical moment, critical issue, and the G7 meeting should be able to go over that. Then there are 2 points about the immorality of nuclear weapons. First of all, the G7 should help the world reject the idea of the policy of deterrence as something as immoral and unethical. And perhaps even a delusion that could spread nuclear weapons, leading to a type of what we call in the international relations subfield of political science, the security dilemma. You know, the increase of weapons increases the probability of some sort of problem, of some sort of war, or even the usage, obviously in this case, of nuclear weapons. Fifthly, the G7 should help us see that the existence of nuclear weapons is a threat, and should we see that the existence of nuclear weapons and the threat of using it in retaliatory attack is immoral as an initial attack. So retaliation use of nuclear weapons is just as bad as first use. It's not true security. The use of nuclear weapons should be banned altogether. Finally, there are 4 points that came back again and again and again about multilateral efforts. First, the G7 should work toward the elimination of nuclear weapons. That should be the first thing. That relates back to my last point. Secondly, the G7 should work to facilitate discussions on multilateral disarmament and non-proliferation if they can't get to the point of elimination, as well as the ending of production of highly enriched uranium needed for nuclear weapons. Fourthly, the G7 should start negotiations or a dialogue for nuclear risk reduction and ways to prevent the unintentional use of nuclear weapons by miscalculation, misunderstanding, and miscommunication. So dialogue is critical. Some sort of, you know, that red phone that they would use to communicate between the former Soviet Union and the United States is critical. And finally, if not all else, the G7 should push for at least the adoption of a no first use policy. It's amazing to understand that the United States doesn't have this no first use policy. All countries that have the weapons should declare this, and we should at least move in this direction, if not for the total banning and elimination of nuclear weapons. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Emmanuel. And Dr. Koli.
Thank you. In my panel, that is the Strengthening Climate, Energy and Health Security, all the panelists, they very nicely and elaborately give lots of recommendations. One of the key area on that recommendations that I found is to ask for deepening and strengthening or broadening the support for other parts of the world. So we can see here Dr. Ela Kokortsis, she mentioned for the further commitments to help for the specific countries, particularly developing countries, and also at the grassroots level, where also she is talking about additional funding and compensations. Whereas Professor Shears is saying that strengthening support for democracies is basically the crucial basis for all kind of climate actions. So whenever we are strengthening all kind of our initiatives, we also need to accelerate that kind of speed and also support the rural communities where combating climate change. The same or similar things also came other presenters like Mark Elder. He also mentioned about G7 should prioritize climate security, and this is the prerequisites for other priorities. And also they are talking about planetary boundaries to recognize the concept, so we really need to broaden and also need to see far more longer perspective through that kind of initiatives. Here also regarding the health issues, Professor Shirayama, he also mentioned about the universal health care initiatives, so to boosting countries, and also the leading role of Japan in this perspective to achieve. So all these recommendations actually amplify. It's not should not be limited on a particular region or particular area, but rather how really we can make it more expansive and for other remote area, other part of the world. Another categories of the recommendations that is for the continuation of support and also continuation of the commitment focusing on like international laws and norms, and also the commitment of phase out fossil fuels. So some of the recommendations that we found on the transitions to renewable energy, energy efficiency, also where I found Professor Shears, he mentioned about to move up that kind of net zero targets to around 2040 according to the IPCC recommendations, and so some others things like expanding battery or other storage capacity. Also I found Kokuktis, she mentioned about nature-based solutions also could be a key key basis. We also found from Eldar that there is should be a strong commitment to phase out fossil fuels, and also starting with that kind of new investments, to stopping that kind of new investments in coal industry. And all of these presenters, they also emphasize and prioritize the commitments for energy conservation efforts and efficiency, strengthening efficiency standard, also sustainable building standards in a number of ways. We also can found there is the different way of including the health issues in other areas like climate change crisis, and also like the global medical countermeasures. So we can see that to promoting a multi-layered global health governance also can contribute to the future climate crisis, and also the security issues. Here also some specific recommendations like developing circular economy for critical minerals, or international cooperation, harmonizations of related standards. We also can see that specific issues like packaging waste or eliminate one-way plastic use, that kind of initiatives. And overall, the other ongoing process like biodiversity protections to climate change, reforestation, afforestation, greening of cities, sustainable forest management, all this should be prioritized so that the G7 meeting in Hiroshima could be really bring specific success. And obviously Japan as a leading positions, and also their experience of that kind of environmentally vulnerable situations, we hope that that can help to achieve a very successful summit in a couple of months. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Koli. So many thanks to all the panel chairs. I think all the panels went pretty smoothly, keeping to time pretty well, and I think the chairs did an excellent job. Also an excellent job in summarizing the recommendations and the discussions from their panels. So thank you very much. So we are coming to the conclusion of the conference. I mean, I would like to thank, personally, I'd like to thank all of the chairs again, all of the speakers, of course. This has been an excellent event, I think. I think it's been a very strong collaboration between ourselves at Soka University, with our colleagues from the G7 Research Group, Soka Gakkai International, the International Academy for Multicultural Cooperation. I think that's one of the great things about this. It isn't just one organization. It's a collaboration. I think that's exactly, someone mentioned earlier about the need to cooperate and coordinate across different issue areas, whether it's nuclear non-proliferation, climate. I mean, that's what we've really done here. We've tried to focus on some key issues and bring together different stakeholders and partners. And thank you, of course, to the audience. You've been very excellent with your questions, your participation, your attendance. It's been quite a long day, but many of you have been here all day. Also, of course, to the team that have worked on this throughout the day, but also in preceding months. There's been a long time in preparation for the last few months. So to everyone involved in that, I thank them as well. And Masataka Aita, as the MC, also has done an excellent job. And I'm going to leave it to him. I think you have some final points to clarify, I believe. So I will leave the floor to you. So thank you very much, everyone.
Hello? Oh, sorry. I'll just try to speak louder. We would like to thank the keynote speaker and all of our wonderful speakers virtually and in person, and all the participants, as it was already mentioned, and those who have supported again behind the scenes to make this event possible. Finally, for our guests who are going to attend the welcome dinner at the hotel, we have arranged transportation for you. Sanada-san and I, we will be assisting you to depart the campus grounds at 5:45. Thank you. Thank you again so much for your participation, and this concludes the International Conference on Advancing Security and Sustainability at the G7 Hiroshima Summit. Thank you.